Good afternoon, and welcome to the Endowment for Middle East Truths weekly webinar featuring Middle East and anti-Semitism expert, Dr. Dave Wurmser. Dave and I will be discussing the numerous issues and conflicts emanating from the Middle East. Given current events in countries from Lebanon to Afghanistan and Israel to Iran, I think you all will find today's discussion both timely and informative, and I'm very excited about having Dave share his insights with you all. As Emmett's New York chapter president and board member, I thank you all for joining. For those listening in today for the first time who are not familiar with Emmett, we are one of Washington, D.C.'s premier think tanks working on issues surrounding the Middle East and Israel. We work daily and tirelessly on Capitol Hill with meetings with senators, congressmen, and their staffers to develop and implement pro-America and pro-Israel policies with great success. Our work is critical to the survival of the Jewish people, both in Israel and in the diaspora, as well as for a strong U.S. national security more generally. And I urge you all to learn more about Emmett by visiting our website at www.emmettonline.org. Please consider supporting our critically important work with a financial donation as well, as it is your support that helps us to be able to continue our work. These are very complicated and trying times, and pro-Israel and pro-America voices must be heard on the Hill, lest we be drowned out by the louder voices who seek Israel's demise and a diminished America. Today's event will be recorded and will be available for viewing in the coming days. You can also submit questions using your Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. I'll do my best to get to as many questions as possible a little later in our program. I'm pleased to now introduce Dr. David Wurmser. Dr. Wurmser is a senior analyst and director of the Project on Global Anti-Semitism and the U.S.-Israel relationship at the Center for Security Policy, as well as being a senior fellow at the Kohelet Policy Forum. He also is the executive and founding member of the Delphi Global Analysis Group, LLC, a firm specializing in geopolitical risk analysis and mitigation for infrastructure, high-tech, defense, and financial firms from the United States, Japan, and India navigating in Israel since its founding in 2007. From December 2018 until September 2019, Dr. Wurmser also served as senior advisor to the U.S. National Security Advisor, Ambassador John Bolton. He was the senior advisor from 2003 to 2007 to Vice President Cheney on Middle East, proliferation, and strategic affairs. Before becoming the senior advisor for the vice president in 2003, Dr. Wurmser was the senior advisor to Undersecretary of State John Bolton at the State Department. Immediately following the 9/11 attacks, Dr. Wurmser consulted until January 2002 with the Office of the Secretary of Defense in the U.S. Department of Defense on a war-related classified project on understanding the nature and strategic significance of terrorist group networks and their interactions with states. Before entering government, he founded the Middle East Studies program at the American Enterprise Institute in 1996. While at AEI, he published Tyranny's Ally, America's Failure to Defeat Saddam Hussein. Dr. Wurmser's military service includes 11 years of intelligence experience in the U.S. Navy Reserves, reaching the rank of lieutenant commander. He was mobilized during the Operational Vigilant Warrior following Iraq's surge toward Kuwait in 1994 to serve on the Iraq Intelligence Task for the DIA. He is the recipient of the prestigious Defense Meritorious Service Medal. In addition to his book, he has published extensively in major periodicals, including the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, and Commentary Magazine. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dave.
Thanks, it's an honor. It's a wonderful organization. I'm glad to be part of it.
Thank you, thank you. I think we're going to have a really exciting conversation over the next hour. Since President Biden has been in office, a man who has been described by former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates as being wrong on every foreign policy decision he's ever made over the past 4 decades, we've seen a number of changes occur very quickly in the Middle East. So I want to focus our discussions this afternoon around recent events, none of which are positive, in my view, and their potential or actual impact on both Israel and U.S. national security interests. So I'm going to start off asking you about Iran, since it seems to be testing American and Israeli resolve under both countries' new administrations, and since Iran has great influence over events in Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. Since Biden entered office, Iran has gotten extremely aggressive, beginning with the Iranian proxies striking Saudi Arabia, and most recently, the brief hijacking of a tanker ship off the coast of the UAE and a drone attack on the Israeli oil tanker Mercer Street that killed 2 people, and in response to which, Israel's defense minister, Benny Gantz, warned that Israel is prepared to strike Iran. Unfortunately, Biden doesn't seem at all prepared to strike Iran. And in fact, after Iran sent a barrage of rockets into northern Iraq, specifically aimed at U.S. bases, resulting in 1 death and other injuries, all we heard from the administration were crickets. So where do you think all of this is heading? Because it can't be a good place.
Well, I mean, first of all, I think the administration here is trying to reverse or is operating under different assumptions than what the Trump administration did. And one has to really acknowledge that a lot of things changed under the Trump administration and that there were a lot of positive effects from those changes. It was the first time in 70 years that we anchored our policy on a different foundation. And that's across the board on a number of issues that we're going to get into, I'm sure, as we go along today. As far as Iran goes, by now it's obvious a decision that was made in the Bush administration, unfortunately never fully carried through early on, that this is really not a regime with which you can ultimately traffic. This is a regime that signs agreements it has no intention to keep. It has violated international law. It is a lawless country internally and externally. So the Biden administration, the very idea of trying to come up with some sort of an agreement, which is in the end an international law issue, is unrealistic. There's no capability of doing that. The second thing is there's a consistent inability to understand the nature of the Iranian regime. Number one, they're true believers. I realize for many Washington elites, the idea of having genuine faith is anathema and certainly alien. But for them, it's real. And their faith is not only that of Shiism, but specific forms of Shiism. So when you look at, for example, Khamenei, or you look at the top ideological core when you look at the ideological core of the IRGC, they're all based on essentially almost an apocalyptic version of Shiism that is truly terrifying and creates a very different calculation. So at the end of the day, here we are trying to negotiate with a regime that operates from an ideological, theological point of view that is beyond our comprehension, trying to come up with an international law agreement when they don't at all value international law. And they are aggressively, strategically advancing across the region in the process and using the diplomatic process accordingly. Gershon Cohen, one of the truly impressive Israeli strategic thinkers, actually put out an article in the last day or two for which he's been given tremendous backlash. But he's absolutely right that Israel is in a state of war. It is a war that is one of the most dangerous Israel's ever had. The Israeli government is not, any Israeli government recently, is not really preparing the Israeli people for the certainty that this will come to some sort of a conflict and to begin to prepare them to accept the cost of this conflict. It may be we get lucky and the Iranian regime collapses before that happens. And it would be helpful if there were more active policy to make that happen. And unfortunately, I think the Biden administration will have an active policy to undo that. But unless that happens, I see Israel and Iran in many shapes and forms coming into very violent conflict in an increasingly dangerous way. And Israel needs to prepare itself, and the Israeli leadership has to begin to prepare the population for the cost of that.
Thank you. And I was going to actually ask you in a couple minutes about the possibility of regime change, because we know that in 2009, when the Green Movement had the momentum of overthrowing the Islamists, Obama chose to side with the mullahs. I guess he was hell-bent on getting a deal. He was already, it was early in his administration, but he was already talking to the Iranians, I guess, behind the scenes. And today there's a lot of protests in the streets in Iran. It sounds like you think it's wishful thinking that there would actually be a regime change, that whatever protests are going on, I mean, the Biden administration is they're so focused on the JCPOA that they're going to look more like Obama 3.0.
The anger of the Iranian people, the complete divorce of the Iranian people from their leadership is real. And it could yet lead to regime change. I'm not entirely unhopeful of that. And I think under a different American administration, say it had happened under the previous administration, a few actions to encourage it, I think would have led to regime change. So this is very real. This is very dangerous. The Iranian government is in an extremely dangerous place. It knows it's in an extremely dangerous place, and it's acting as essentially a cornered animal on some level. But that said, this administration is operating under the same assumption the Biden administration did, which is a nuclear deal is in hand and is capable of being achieved. And as a result, that matters more than any attempt at regime change, et cetera, et cetera. So they're going to prioritize that. The Iranian people will feel abandoned. It will deflate them to some extent. Whether it deflates them enough to stop this, I don't know. But it will certainly deflate them. And it's a real tragedy. Iran is desperate. The people are desperate. An effective strategy on Iran, there's a couple things to remember. The Iranians are better at strategy than we are. We all play the game of chess. Chess is a very sophisticated game of strategy, and we forget that chess was invented in Persia. And the Iranians are very good at that. The second thing to remember about the Iranians is that Scheherazade, the Tale of 1001 Nights, comes from Persia originally. We in Judaism have sort of a spin-off with the story of Esther, but the bottom line of that is Scheherazade was the symbol of abject weakness. She was about to be executed the next morning. She was the symbol of powerlessness against the absolute power of the Shah. And she used the storytelling not only to buy time, but to slowly twist the soul of the king to the end, until at the end she marries him and she controls him. She becomes the most powerful person. This is the story of Persian strategy. How do you use your weakness through manipulation to become powerful over the most powerful force and then use that as an agent of power? So if you take the chess analogy and the sophistication of strategy and Scheherazade together, you begin to get an appreciation that the Biden administration is up against an enemy that is several leagues higher than they are.
It's always been fascinating to me that both Obama and now Biden are so singularly obsessed with getting a deal without understanding the long-term implications of that. And you talk about buying time. I mean, Benny Gantz recently warned that Iran will reach nuclear breakout capacity in 10 weeks. I don't know how accurate that is. And Dave, maybe you could, share with our audience how realistic you think that is and what that means, because we do know that Biden is singularly obsessed and everybody in his administration came basically from Obama's administration and from Kerry and Power and Rice and, all these people are just obsessed with getting a deal without really understanding that it doesn't stop Iran's quest for a nuclear weapon.
Yeah.
So, what are your thoughts on the 10-week period that Gantz warned? And then also, if you can kind of touch on Iran's new president, Raisi. He recently spoke to the French President Macron about Macron's and the parties to the JCPOA obligation to fulfill their side of that contract. But we know that Iran's not going to fulfill their side of the contract. So what do you think of Raisi and how he, with the new president, how he plays into all this as well?
Sure. Well, starting with Gantz, being in the government at the time in 2005, 6, 7, it became clear about 2006, 2007 that the amount of intelligence that Israel had on Iran and quality of its intelligence actually began to surpass ours. And it was of very high quality. So, and I assume the trend continued. So if Gantz says they're within 10 weeks, then they're probably capable of doing that. If they are indeed within 10 weeks, then it says one and only one thing, which is that they were doing a lot of nuclear work that was secret, that was beyond what the JCPOA covered. And right there is an indictment of the JCPOA, that it covered what wasn't the problem. The real problem was the secret work of nuclearization, warhead development, refinement of centrifuges for rapid breakout, the nuclear potential missile developments, and so forth, all of which were not covered by the JCPOA, all of which obviously the Iranians have been working on very aggressively. So I think that assessment alone is an indictment of the JCPOA. I would take it very seriously. The one thing I do have to say about guns, and this is a concern I have about the Israelis, not only this administration, but frankly, its security establishment going back 30, 40 years. At the end of the day, the purpose of Zionism is to ensure that the Jewish people are the masters of their destiny and that they defend themselves. And whether or not the United States agrees, Israel must act on the basis of what it must do, not on the basis of America can do it better if we can only bring them around, or, oh, the strategic relationship with America is so important that we can't, et cetera, et cetera. Israel has to remember the point of Zionism, and the point of Zionism is going to be tested very soon. So that's the 10-week issue and Benny Gantz. As far as Raisi goes, this is a grisly man. This is a grisly man who has many grisly friends. He's in that clique that includes people like Saeed Jalili, who was the national security advisor about 10 years ago, et cetera. This is the IRGC clique that is not only from among the Ayatollahs, but believe it or not, the Ayatollahs could be considered the rational school of Shiism. Though the rationality led to an awful government, a horrible government, a true totalitarian dictatorship, in my view. But this is an additional level of danger because these people also, as I said, believe in sort of an apocalyptic return of the 12th Imam, and that man can be the agent of expediting that return, and they're true believers. So while I haven't seen enough evidence to know that Raisi is fully in that camp, he is a close associate of Khamenei, and I believe Khamenei wound up in that camp. It's called the Mahadist force. Certainly Soleimani was, in the top levels of the IRGC are, and realistically speaking, Khamenei rules the country, but he knows that his power relies on the IRGC. He was almost killed in the early 80s. In assassination attempts and so forth by many of these very types from the IRGC. And eventually he did a very Iranian thing. He cut a deal with them. He managed to secure his survival, in return for which they became his posse, so to speak. And ever since then, to look at Khamenei as a true spiritual heir to Khomeini or to some of these other Ayatollahs is erroneous. He is really, truly the tip of the iceberg of the IRGC crowd, which was suppressed to some, this Mahadist faction was suppressed by Khomeini at the beginning. So to look at him as this tip of the iceberg of the IRGC crowd, you see, when you look at Khomeini, you should be looking at Soleimani and his legacy. You should be looking at that crowd. This is a terrifying crowd. So not only is he grisly internally, has no value for life, his friends are people like Kalibaf, who was the man who gave keys to children to run across mines so they'd go to heaven and the mines were cleared, or as human shields in front of the Iraqi army, the Iran-Iraq war. The architect of Give Your Child for the Revolution campaign. These are people who their own children they sent to their death, knowingly and willingly and happily. This is not a crowd one can make a deal with. What one has to do with a crowd like this, to go back to the chess analogy, is one Iranian once told me, chess is a very refined game with intricate rules. But what happens if you're playing chess with a gorilla? And the next day, after 20 hours or so of this very intricate play, you manage to maneuver him into what is clearly checkmate. And the gorilla just looks at the chessboard, reaches over, grabs your king, and eats it. You don't know what to do. You're paralyzed. He broke the rules. He did the unexpected. And you are the one who are paralyzed as a result. And he essentially walks away happy. This is the way the Iranians play strategy with us. They break the rules suddenly, and it shocks us. And we don't know how to react, and we pause, and we have to be the gorilla. That's what we have to do with Iran right now, which means we have to undertake actions that the Iranians could not possibly expect. That will terrify them. That will fear them. And if they show fear, the Iranian people will smell it. People in these totalitarian countries are experts at one thing more than anything else, which is how to smell fear of their leadership. And if we induce that fear through actions, they will be encouraged to rise up. I think the assassination of Soleimani was precisely such a thing. And I think historically one really does need to attribute to some extent what is happening right now with these riots and demonstrations, and the ones that have been happening for quite a while, on the fear that the Iranian government evinced after the assassination of Soleimani last year. So that is what we have to do. But unfortunately, the Biden administration is I think constitutionally incapable of seeing things that way or making decisions like that, and instead still believes that potentially in their weakness, the Iranians will sign a deal that can be enforced.
Before I move on from Iran, what would you say to people that say that it's actually Trump who has gotten us to this point? He pulled out of the JCPOA, and so Iran, started taking actions that they weren't doing otherwise. Now, you point out that a lot of the movement forward in their program was because there were all of these carve-outs from the JCPOA that allowed them to pursue various aspects of their program. So what do you say to people that think that this is all Trump's fault?
Well, what the JCPOA was essentially a deal to ask Iran to pause their program in exchange for which they get a sudden breakout capability. I mean, why wouldn't it be a deal that Iran would accept then? Because they got what they needed, two things. One is the legitimacy of a breakout, namely the more advanced centrifuges. They could do all the research and work. They were anyway in a scientific pause at the moment where they needed to work on some of their activities. So I doubt it even slowed down their program. And the second thing it obviously did was it validated it for some future period, which was really not far in the future. So here we are getting closer and closer to the moment where they anyway would have broken out legally under the JCPOA. They were cheating around the outside of it, which we had to have known about. We never bothered to even implement the JCPOA. And that, what I mean is act number 1 of the JCPOA was a baseline revelation by Iran of all that it had done. And when the Israelis captured the archives, we realized the Iranians never came clean on what they had done. So the JCPOA wasn't even initially implemented. And then finally, it validated their ability to develop a breakout capability at any time they decide to. So here we are. I don't think the JCPOA did anything other than validate what should never have been validated.
Right. Thank you for that, Dave. I'm gonna move on and talk head towards Lebanon now, and Iran sort of permeates this whole region anyway. Economically, Lebanon is in a very dire situation. Politically, the government seems to be in disarray, with its prime minister resigning after the massive explosion last summer, and then its prime minister designate resigning this last month. Militarily, Hezbollah appears to be becoming more aggressive with its recent rocket attack on Israel. What does this instability mean in terms of Iranian influence, Hezbollah aggression towards Israel, and the country's ability to not completely fall apart? Can the Lebanese armed forces, with or without the assistance of the UN interim force in Lebanon, play any role in stabilizing the situation? And what do you believe the long-term prospects are for a stabilized situation?
Well, first on the geopolitical level and the threat to Israel directly, one has to look at what's happening with the Houthis down in Yemen, and what's happening with Lebanon, what's happening with the movement of Shiite militias and the Iranian forces into Syria. Israel is waking up to being surrounded by Iran. And this is what Gershon Cohen, I think, was referring to when he said Israel is, in fact, in a war, is, in fact, on the eve of a very dangerous war, and it has to prepare itself now. The way Israel, and he used this analogy, the way that Israel did in 67, just before the 67 war. So I think when you look at these various countries from the geopolitical point of view, the first thing that occurs to you that is apparent is that Iran is surrounding Israel and tightening the cordon, the circle around the country. As far as Lebanon goes, last summer, after the big, the nuclear level, conventional explosion, but nuclear level of explosion that ripped apart the center of Beirut, everybody began to realize, the Lebanese people began to realize this was over. The presence of Hezbollah had destroyed the country, and they couldn't take it anymore. And on some brief moment, the international community really wanted to help, but they approached it from the wrong assumption. The assumption was that Lebanon was still a real state and its institutions were still real institutions. So the idea was to strengthen the state, strengthen the institutions, and demand a transformation, or at least an evolution of the Lebanese government to something that could be more appropriate and responsive to the needs of the Lebanese people. What was wrong about that is there wasn't a Lebanon anymore, and there were no institutions in Lebanon outside of the control of Hezbollah. We cannot give Lebanon anything that will help reconstitute that government as long as Hezbollah is there and is so powerful. So at the end of the day, we're dealing with Hezbollah when we're dealing with the Lebanese government. So our policy has to be fundamentally different. It isn't to strengthen the Lebanese armed forces or to strengthen the Lebanese government against Hezbollah. It's to destroy Hezbollah. This goes down to the core of it all. Everything boils down to Iran. If you're not going to win in Lebanon until you deal with Iran. You're not going to destroy Hezbollah until you deal with Iran. Well, if you destroy Hezbollah, it could actually destroy Iran. It's so critical to who Iran is. To think that Iran will let go voluntarily or doesn't have won't go to the mat over this is completely it's completely wrong. The reason for it is Lebanon is the conduit for money for Iran. It's not only the black market, money laundering, etc., but they've sucked that country completely dry. They've emptied their banks. They've used their fields for opiate trade. They've used probably all their Xerox machines and printing presses for counterfeit. They have used Lebanon to the point like a parasite that has essentially gutted its host. And so there is no Lebanon anymore. And what's left of it is literally only a money machine, an ATM for the Iranians who are out of money. So they can't give up on Lebanon. It is a central part of their strategy. It is a central core of their, it is the core of their path to survival as a regime financially and with international networks. It's the core of their international structure of terrorism. So they can't give it up. They're going to fight to the mat over it. So unless we're willing to get in a full tilt conflict with Iran, we can't deal with the issue of Lebanon effectively. And getting in a full tilt conflict with Iran means that there's going to be a very dangerous period of war with Hezbollah. And it's a price that I wish the United States would realize and be willing also to pay. But in the very least, I would hope Israel realizes it has no choice anymore, but to confront this decisively soon.
So that's a good transition into my next question. For years, Israel was able to strike targets, including Iranian bases and weapons facilities inside Syria, undeterred in order to prevent very dangerous weapons, including precision-guided missiles, from being transferred from Iran through Syria to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Those days now seem to be over, since it was reported last month that Russia assisted Syria's aerial defense in thwarting an Israeli attack in Western Syria. A Russian source is claiming that Biden was not supportive of Israel's defensive measures and specifically asked the Russians to intervene to end them. This is a true betrayal by Biden of Israel, if it's in fact true. Why in the world would the Biden administration turn its back on Israel in favor of assisting Assad, Iran, and Hezbollah? And why would Russia want to enable Iranian aggression in the region and close off Syrian airspace to Israeli planes? Does Israel have the logical ability to evade Russia's defense system so that it can continue to protect itself?
You really have to go back to 2002-3 and where all these diplomatic processes with Iran began, because I think what happened in eastern Syria with the United States and the Biden administration, if the reports are true, was really sort of an outcrop of this larger policy of dealing with Iran. And at the center of it was that the diplomatic process, the greatest fear in Washington was to achieve deterrence. But the deterrence wasn't of Iran, it was of Israel. It was of Israel's potential to strike Iran. So the diplomatic process, and I know I had to travel to London and Paris and Berlin and then also all over the place in Europe and in Latin America, trying to coordinate our strategy, our policy with all these allies and quote like-minded nations on Iran. And the message was very clear that I got from everybody, which was that Colin Powell and Richard Armitage and a number of other people inside the US government, their primary concern was to create enough of a diplomatic process, not to stop Iran, but to stop Israel, to create the image of progress so that Israel would have the rug pulled out from under it to strike Iran. And the United States, in 2003, there was the worry that the United States itself and Vice President Cheney and the rest of the, quote, neocons, which included me by their accusation at the time. I'm not a true neocon, but they blame me for it, so I'll accept that appellation for that moment. But at any rate, their concern was an aggressive, robust strike on Iran, or even, God forbid for them, a repeat of the Iraq War. So that was the essence of the diplomatic process. The entirety of the diplomatic process from then till now, I think, is as much directed at Israel to stop Israel from striking Iran under the idea that there will be some sort of uncontrollable apocalypse if that happens. I don't know why the obsession with stopping Israel from striking Iran is there. All the war games before the last few years, the 10 years going back, 15 years going back, showed that Iran really doesn't have a lot of options to respond if Israel responds or the United States responds. They have no good escalatory strategy. Their only strategy is to convince us that they have an escalatory strategy. They don't really have one. So at the end of the day, we deterred ourselves, we deterred Israel, and that is the essence of our diplomatic process. So in that context, it is almost an inescapable, inevitable result that if we fear that Israel is going to strike Iran in a way that could anger Iran, that we would act to intervene to try to calm that and try to stop that. Again, our policy is to keep Israel from acting on its own. By the way, this is a major difference on a much, much, much larger scale between the Trump administration and every other administration. Going back to World War II, and if you talk to Japanese diplomats, Korean diplomats, Indian diplomats, real allies, Colombian diplomats, they'll all tell you the same thing. The United States' foreign policy establishment believed, I mean, partly legitimately early on because of containment and the need to really be in control of our containment strategy against the Soviet Union. But we essentially went around to all our allies and we cut a grand bargain that they really had no choice over, which was we would assume from them the burden of their defense, but they in turn would relinquish their independence of action in a way that could embarrass us or just whatever we in Washington thought was not helpful. So there was that grand bargain that wasn't that willing on the other side. And with that also came a spoke system, by the way, which was that every relationship was bilateral with all our various allies. We didn't really like allies talking to each other and coordinating their policies without us. So there was this great deal of emphasis on control coming from the Washington policy establishment. And this governs their behavior toward Israel, and it really contributes greatly to this terror that there is in Washington over Israeli independence of action. I think it also goes to the Abraham Accords a little bit because, as I mentioned, the spoke system, here were a number of American allies across the region suddenly talking to each other. And the big novelty of the Trump administration was that he said, no, why do we assume the defense burden for all these nations when it's not even really helping them? why don't we just let them do what they need to do? They're our allies. Their actions and the strengthening of them will inherently strengthen our position. So here's what we'll do. You have to now, you Israel, you Japan, you India, you Colombia, you begin to assume more responsibility over your defense. But in return for which, we're not gonna harp on you. We're not gonna sit on your back like a monkey, constantly second guessing you and wagging our finger at you. And that released these countries to start forming powerful alliances regionally that not only led to the peace, a real peace in the Abraham Accords, but also led to a powerful structure that allows the United States to have less of a footprint, but greater access to its interests. So that was the novelty of the Trump administration. And the Biden administration is returning back to square one, back to the governing assumptions of the last 70, really 100 years of the Middle East, which have not once, but probably more times than I have fingers to count, failed catastrophically. And yet, maybe the 11th time will work.
I'm glad you brought up the Abraham Accords, Dave. I'm sure that a lot of people want your thoughts on this. It does look like Biden is, if not actively trying to undermine them, certainly not supporting them in any way, shape, or form. And whether it goes to the F-35s to the UAE and whatever deals were made by Trump to help do you think that they are strong enough to withstand whatever the Biden administration throws over the next couple of years?
I think they are. You see, at the end, I mean, look, what's happened here is that the Western elites, including Washington elites, will never forgive an Arab for abandoning the Palestinians. So their hatred of the Abraham Accords is because it's humiliated the insistence they've had, which is frankly much greater in European and American capitals in Washington than in the Middle East. That there's no progress, there's no peace, there's no nothing without progress on the Palestinian issue. They really have bought the line Yasser Arafat said at the United Nations in the early 70s, which is they're in the Middle East equation. There is nothing without the factor of the Palestinians, that we are the central factor. And here they're not in the Abraham Accords. So they will never forgive the UAE, Bahrain, or Israel for daring to prove that assumption wrong. And the Washington elites, the entire career of 90% of the Middle East analysts in Washington has been proven to be fundamentally flawed. So people's careers are on the line and they're going to be very angry about it. And reality just didn't go their way. As far as surviving, though, goes, ironically, the Trump administration laid that groundwork that we discussed just a moment ago of allies banding together to become more serious and picking up their interests, in exchange for which we let them do what they do. And that sort of released the UAE and Israel to pursue their interests. But deeper down, in some ways, this really began under the Obama administration, where the UAE and Bahrain became so terrified that the United States was losing its way and straying into la-la land that, it's a matter of survival. Who do they turn to? And they took Israel as a serious country who had a common enemy. And, in the Middle East, Arab society is one of those cultures that ultimately emerges from its original nomadic existence, and nomadic tribes. The first rule of leadership is cut a path to survival, and so that is what the UAE and Bahrain did, and it started under Obama. So ironically, the Biden administration may even deep down on some level strengthen the Abraham Accords by showing once again the United States is not a good ally and not a very good crutch for pursuing your survival. Again, the only caveat a little bit on that is the Israelis themselves. The more they try to appease the United States on things like the peace process or defer to the United States on things like striking Iran, the weaker the Israelis will look and the less useful they are as an ally. So the irony of it all is, if Israel stood on its own feet and said, we love you, America, but we have our lives at stake and our interests are deeply threatened here, and we will act and then go ahead and act, it will actually strengthen the support Israel has across the region from countries like the UAE, Bahrain, quietly from Saudis, and on the other end from people like Haftar or Morocco or so forth. These are one needs to think like a tribal leader. Who you don't want to side. There's no principle here. Your single objective is to find the strong person, the future power, and align with it. That's your path for survival. And if Israel is that, then they will continue to strengthen the Abraham Accords, so it will survive. If Israel loses its way and becomes way too deferential to the United States, they will become less and less useful.
Thank you. I'm going to move away from that part of the region and turn to Afghanistan. While President Trump had discussed pulling U.S. troops out of the country, he never finalized an agreement with the Taliban and did not proceed with our withdrawal. Now Biden, also without an agreement with the Taliban, is moving full steam ahead with the US and NATO pulling out, and the country seems to already be blown up, with the Taliban making significant advances, killing government officials, including in its capital, Kabul, and apparently taking full control of Afghan cities across the country. What does this pullout mean in terms of the stability of Afghanistan and its impact on the region, if any? It's poor citizens who are being displaced by the hundreds of thousands, tortured and murdered by the Taliban, and who are the ones who are truly paying the price for our failed policies. And what do you think the US should be doing differently?
Well, I mean, there's no doubt that the withdrawal of American forces is going to lead to a Vietnam-like collapse in Afghanistan. We're seeing it already, and that has both a human tragedy of people who were associated with the United States and thought we were the great strong horse and aligned with us. Their lives are in immediate danger. The larger question of the Afghani people who will suffer horribly. There's no doubt that this is going to be an immense human tragedy. On the next level, though, you cannot really reasonably lay out any hope for the Taliban being anything other than what they've always been. They are who they are. They're believers. They're essentially like Al-Qaeda, ISIS. It's part of the larger crisis of Sunni Islam that finds an answer in a nostalgic reversion to a jihad-based structure of Salafism and so forth. So at the end of the day, the Taliban will be what they were before 1999, 2000. They will be essentially the cover for Al-Qaeda, except this time they'll be maybe like Al-Qaeda. So this is the resurrection again of the caliphate we saw in eastern Syria and western Iraq. They just have a new geographic location as the base. And we should expect that, and we should expect the consequences of that. And it will be grisly, and it will be awful. It will also, on the larger geopolitical sense, again display a sense of American weakness. And whether one can stay in Iraq and Afghanistan another 10 years, 20 years, American people have had enough. And I would argue because they felt the US government was never serious enough to really win. And if they're not going to win, the American people would rather go home. So one can debate whether the last 20 years was the right strategy and led to this moment. But the truth is the American people see a futility in this perpetual presence there. But the consequence of our withdrawal, I don't think is fully appreciated in the United States. That everything in the world, even ironically anti-American institutions, are anchored to the perception of American power. These are formal agreements like the UN Charter, informal ones like the security architecture of East Asia, and even, as I said, anti-American institutions and so forth, really depend on the presence of American power to survive. And I can't emphasize how much Americans do not understand that their way of life and their quality of life is dependent on the preeminence of American power. And unfortunately, that bears a cost. And I think, unfortunately, we're going to feel the consequences to our quality of life and to our perception in the world, and it will make the need for a more robust American policy and a greater intervention with more war, unfortunately, the reality sometime in the future. So it's a disaster. It's a disaster that I don't think is avoidable right now, because the American people took the measure of their leadership and found it not serious and want to go home. But there will be consequences that are horrible.
Thank you for bringing that back to our national security, because yeah, I'm as concerned as you are for what this means in the long run. Before we open it up to audience questions, I wanted to turn to the flourishing anti-Semitism that we see across the globe. I find it unbelievably frightening, and now it's not only on our college campuses and in fringe extremist groups, it's in the mainstream and social media, it's in corporate America, as we see with Ben & Jerry's and 2 years ago with Airbnb, and it's now in the halls of Congress and seemingly green-lighted by congressional leadership, including by Pelosi and Schumer, who elevate the anti-Semites to important positions and either defend their hatred or remain silent in its face. As someone who spends a great deal of time addressing this very complicated issue, can you spend a few minutes talking about where you see things going given the current political climate here in the US, and whether, like me, you fear the long-term viability of Jews living safely in this country, while also worrying that America's days of remaining Israel's closest friend and supporter in a world of so many countries who seek her demise are waning?
Yeah, I hear a lot about people talking about the threat of the Corbynization of the left, i.e. that the left will go the way of the Labour Party in Great Britain, led by Jeremy Corbyn, who tolerated anti-Semitism and essentially turned Labour Party into cover for anti-Semitism. So I hear a lot of talk about the threat of that. The truth is it's already happened. The left here, there is a threat also from this nativist right. I'm not denying that. We all know it. Neo-Nazis have never been our friend. We all know they're out there. I remember as a kid talking about the Skokie issue and so forth. Not denying that. But what is denied is the immense and aggressive and extensive rise of anti-Semitism on the left, and the real tolerance of it. First of all, the denial of its existence from people on the left, and the tolerance of it. You mentioned that they're green-lighted now in Congress. They're green-lighted in the administration. There are senior American officials who have countenanced anti-Semitism, even engaged in rhetoric and so forth that's rather anti-Semitic. So if the United States government is sanctioning and anti-Semitism, then it becomes, as I said, we are there already with the Corbynization of the left. It's not a threat. It's happened. That's number one. Number two, I think one has to put it in a larger context here, which is the destruction of America. The United States, since its beginning, has been the New Jerusalem, which meant the old Jerusalem meant something, whether it was the potential for Hebrew being the national language, the idea that we were a beacon among nations, to repeat what ancient Israel had been a beacon among nations. There was a Judeo-philic element to the United States from before there was a United States. There had been repeated mutterings, writings, musings of some of the greatest American officials, like Abraham Lincoln, of actively working to create an army to liberate the area of ancient Israel and give it to the Jews. So Zionism, not just Judeo-philic behavior, is part of American culture, non-Jewish American culture, going back to before there even was a United States. So as you see anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism rise, it is in a form of expression of destruction of the United States. And I think where it really goes down to is there is an appreciation on the progressive side that the Judeo-Christian culture of underpins the United States. Yes, there is this trilateral pillars to the West in the United States. It's Athens, it's Rome, and it's Jerusalem. And they understand that they need to destroy the Jerusalem pillar of the United States. There's no basis for their revolution, the progressive revolution, and the individual inalienable rights of man. There's no capability of overcoming that and replacing it with a communal definition of rights and overpowering the foundations of our Constitution. They can't do that if they don't eradicate the Judeo-Christian core of the United States. And one of the horrible things about that is they realize, many of them unfortunately are Jews, Peter Beinart, for example, and so forth. So there's a real rise of Jewish anti-Semitism. They understand that as I said on every Passover, every generation there will arise somebody who seeks to destroy the Jewish people. But the truth is they never have. So the real path to destroy the Jewish people is from within. And so that is the emphasis right now, is to essentially use these anti-Semitic Jews as cover to destroy Judaism from within, and through it to destroy Zionism from within, and to destroy Israel, and with it ultimately the objective, and make no mistake about it, it's to destroy the United States. The first battle of this, and perhaps a decisive battle of this, will be the survival of Israel and the integrity of the Jewish people. So that's the nature of anti-Semitism that's arisen on the left. And the tolerance of it is part and parcel of the larger tearing down of statues, the culture war, etc. This is all an inherent part of this assault to destroy the West.
So I have been arguing, when I speak about anti-Semitism, we recognize it, of course, on the far right, but there's the far left is much more insidious, and it's because it's infiltrated all of our institutions. It's academia, it's the government now, and it's corporate, it's media. When the New York Times prints Peter Beinart op-eds like the one that he put out today on exposing Israel's nukes, I love that you brought it back to our own people and how destructive we are being to both Israel and Western civilization, and it's very distressing. So I'm going to move on to the audience questions, and then somebody had emailed me a question yesterday that I'm going to start with. You have previously advocated for more muscular strategies in the Mideast, removing Saddam Hussein preemptive strikes in Iran and Syria. Not exactly policies of strategic patience or leading from behind. You recently pointed out that this administration has favored a foreign policy featuring a lack of control and neutrality toward our enemies. As CIA Director Burns sits down with Bennett and Mossad's Barnier this week to discuss Iran, what would your advice be to each side of that table? And assuming your advice is not heeded, or at least by the American side, how do you see things playing out on the Iranian front?
Well, there's so many problems here. First of all, one should never send a CIA director to be a diplomat, because then he will have to cloud all intelligence, which is supposed to be a reality check. His institution is then invested in the diplomatic process, and then you can never have any intelligence produced that might challenge that invested interest. So it is probably one of the worst ideas in corruption of intelligence agencies ever to involve intelligence directors in a diplomatic process. That's right off the bat. The second thing is, this is not a diplomatic mission. This is a diplomatic seance. The PA is dead. Arab nationalism, which is the foundation of the PLO, is dead. They have less currency on the Arab street than the value of Argentinian currency in the early 80s. There's nothing. It's valueless. So the PA has only one path to survival, which is essentially status quo, and have the Israelis enforce that status quo. They don't ever admit it, but they know that they don't survive unless the Israelis are present. So they really don't want a resolution of this process. It will be suicide. They want a process. They want Israel to believe that they're security cooperating and that there may be hope for a diplomatic process. And in that way, they can convince the Israelis still that there's some utility in the PA, or the United States that there's some utility in the PA. But the last thing the PA wants is any progress in the peace process, because they can't deliver and it will destroy them. The second thing is, these are not factors that matter anymore. They're ghosts. The PA, the PLO. So this is a seance. That's why I said it's a diplomatic seance. Unfortunately, the lack of the constant attempt to anchor peace processes to the PLO have blocked us from creating alternative leaderships in the West Bank and Gaza, or Judea and Samaria. The local Palestinian leadership was challenged by the reentry of the PLO. The PLO's very existence is anchored to the questions of 1948, namely the existence of Israel, and not the questions of 1967, which is the dispensation of the Judea and Samaria and Gaza. So at the end of the day, the very bringing in of the PLO was resurrecting the one question that could never be addressed, which is, it's an either-or situation. In 1948, was it good Israel was created, or should it not have been created? That is the question that the PLO symbolizes. So the inherent, even when Arab nationalism still had some currency, this was never going to go anywhere. It was an illusion. But now they don't even have any currency. So we're chasing an assumption that was flawed to begin with, trying to find something concrete to hold on to that is in fact an apparition. So this is very dangerous. At the end of the day, the last war told us that. The last war between Israel and Hamas in May. What happened there was Hamas showed itself. It showed itself to be in control of the Arab Street, in control of the Jerusalem portfolio, and sadly, the Israelis woke up to discover that their belief in that Israeli Arabs, there was a firewall that will never be crossed, and that they were Israeli Arabs, they were not Palestinians, that was crossed. And all of a sudden there was, and let's be real and call it what it was. It was a Palestinian intifada inside Israel. This wasn't a civil war like some people call it. There was a big debate on Israeli TV between Ronnie Daniel, who just passed away, the security correspondent, Amit Segal, who was their political correspondent, and Daniela Weiss, who was one of the anchor women. She said, no, this is Jew and Arab both doing terrible things. And they both said, yeah, I mean, you're going to find one or two Jews who went nuts and they did the wrong thing. But you're talking about thousands of cases. This is a pogrom. This is a one-sided attack. And that's what happened. And we have to understand this was an intifada. This was an uprising of Israel's Arabs. And the only response to it is to, again, go back to what I said about the UAE and others, is this is ultimately politics in the Middle East, politics in the Arab world is inherently nomadic in its outlook, which means if the interest of a leader inside in Judea and Samaria, a community leader, and he has genuine community following, is there, and Israel shows itself to be strong and clearly the power to be reckoned with in the long term, they will find a way to make their, not peace, but their reconciliation with the Jewish state and live with it. Perhaps that's what we're seeing with with Mansour Abbas in the party that's in the Israeli government. I'm not sure, we'll see over time, but certainly that's a decision he's making. You saw it with, by the way, we all go to Jerusalem. On the way, we stop in Abu Ghosh and eat hummus. That's the decision the tribal leaders in Abu Ghosh made in 1948. And look, it's why they're thriving as a town. And a few miles away in Judea or Samaria, there were Palestinian towns that were not thriving at all. So that's the path to peace, is that Israel has to understand it must be the power in control of the situation from the Jordan River until the sea. Whether it is present and there all the time, I don't know, but it needs to understand the communal leaders, the traditional communal leaders of these structures throughout Gaza, Judea, and Samaria. They must be impressed with the idea that Israel is here, Israel is powerful, and that their own survival and interests are dependent on the survival and strength of the Jewish state.
Thank you. Very insightful, Dave. There's a number of questions from people that are asking whether there's a military pathway for Israel to strike Iran successfully and have it not be cataclysmic. Somebody actually asked that despite Israel's anti-missile systems blanketing Israel, do you think that Israel will be forced to use tactical nukes, assuming they have them, to defeat Hezbollah, to destroy Iran's nuclear capabilities to prevent major damage to Israel's infrastructure? And do you think that the Gulf states will play a role in a military confrontation with Iran?
If Israel modulates its response and tries to return to some policy of deterrence vis-a-vis Hezbollah or Syria or Iran or Hamas, like we saw in the last war, deterrence is a dangerous path to go with these organizations. I think that the 40, 50-year embrace of this American-based idea by the security establishment in Israel has genuinely produced a strategic deterioration. There's no understanding, even in Israel, of the nature of Arab warfare and the nature of Arab strategy, going all the way back to Muhammad and so forth. It's the use of irregular warfare, asymmetric warfare, terrorism, piracy, however you want, raiding, tribal raiding, whatever. It changes the fundamental realities on the ground, erodes the will, erodes the key structures of the enemy, and then eventually they can just be swept aside with minimal effort. That's the Arab strategy, that's the Iranian strategy, that's the Islamic strategy. And deterrence doesn't work with that, because you are imposing on them a clarity and red line structure that they are deliberately evading. So every time I hear the Israelis saying, "Oh, we showed them, they're not going to," I know that there's another round coming fairly soon, and that should be clear after the last round between Hamas and Israel. So the real policy Israel has to take is to exact a devastating price on the enemy, which is to destroy them. That will be clear, that those who genuinely threaten Israel will not be around to tell their grandkids about it. That has to be the response. That's why the PLO was dead after 1982. It only survived by Israel's indulgence. It was dead because the Israelis had essentially convinced the world, convinced the Palestinians, convinced the Arabs that the PLO was dead. It was no longer the force for the future. So that has to be Israel's policy. And if Israel reverts to deterrence and some form of deterrence, it's going to have a messy, ugly war. As far as really striking Iran, there's two things I think one needs to remember. One is, my sense is that Israel will pay a fairly heavy price in the immediate term, the first few days. But if the response is decisive, and again, this goes back to Gershon Cohen's article on "We're on the eve of another 67 war." If Israel acts as if it's the 67 war and goes in for the jugular and decisively defeats the enemy in a rapid, massive, overwhelming assault, this will be much easier. It will have, yes, the first day will be bad, the second day will be not as bad, the third day will be less. Israel must prepare for hundreds, thousands of missiles. However, it will be over, and it'll be over quicker and faster than they think. And my appreciation is that once the Iranian people see such blood drawn of their own government and their lack of love and disgust with how much of their national resources and efforts have been wasted throwing it for all these adventures across the Middle East, specifically the Palestinians and Lebanese and so forth, my sense is the anger in Iran will reach such an explosive level that the Iranian government will no longer be able to control it. Again, the Iranian people will smell weakness and they will act. So I think a war like this that Israel, I think, is now facing, it's coming. If it acts decisively rather than thinks in terms of deterrence, it can fundamentally change the strategic situation in the Middle East. Because if the Iranian regime falls, we're talking about such a dramatically different reality afterwards.
Yeah. Thank you, Dave. It's after 1. I'm just going to read one final question, and then we'll bring it to a close. And I apologize for not getting to everyone's questions. China is an increasing threat to the world order and American leadership. What is Israel's relationship to China? Is China a player in the Iranian chess match?
You know, the Abraham Accords are, if you look at it as a strategic axis, so to speak, an alliance, sort of an alliance between Bahrain, UAE, Israel to to survive the threat of not only Iran, but Turkey, you begin to see that there are extensions to this alliance. On the western side, you have Greece, you have Cyprus, and perhaps further on. On the eastern side, you have India, and with India and the Far East, you have Japan, because the relationship between India and Japan are very strong. So essentially, through the Abraham Accords, Israel is becoming an East Asian player, or potentially becoming an East Asian player if this strategic alliance is expanded into a real strategic swath of like-minded allies. But that demands of Israel to begin to make choices on a strategic situation in the Far East. And it can't go on with China. It has to make a choice. And its choice lies ultimately with India, with Japan, and that bloc. The second thing I think that Israel has to realize about China is that this deal with Iran and what is going on with Pakistan and with Erdogan, the Chinese are no longer what they used to be, which is a shadow of the Soviets and just following the Soviets' footstep and just trying to maintain their access to oil and trying to keep their head down. They're beginning to become a regional player, and their play is essentially to create this alliance between these unlikely allies of Iran and Erdogan. First and foremost, and I think this is not appreciated here in Washington, to drive Pakistan into conflict with India and deal with the Indian issue. We're not paying attention to how much Erdogan is destabilizing India. And India understands this. And the UAE, who again, I think aligned with Israel as much because of Turkey as it did because of Iran, I think this is a critical thing to remember, is China is now a player in this internal balance of power, and it's playing on the side of Erdogan and Iran. It's not a neutral player anymore.
We could talk all afternoon about these issues. I'm still getting questions sent in, and I apologize to everyone. Maybe we'll have to have a follow-up with Dave in the future to continue discussing, because we didn't get to Turkey, Iraq. There's regions we haven't even touched on, but you were so insightful as always, Dave, and I really appreciate, and Sarah Stern, all of us at AMET appreciate you taking the time to be with us today and share your insights. And thank you all for joining. We look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon.